Strain, so much you strain.
Chapter 1. On the morning of January 15, 1947, a woman walking with her young child through a vacant lot in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles noticed something pale against the grass. At first glance, it looked artificial. A discarded mannequin, broken and unwanted. In a city still expanding outward, open land often became a dumping ground. But as she stepped closer, the shape resolved into something unmistakably human. The body was arranged deliberately. It had been cut cleanly in two at the waist. The skin was pale, drained of blood. The face bore deep, precise slashes extending from the corners of the mouth, creating an expression that looked like a forced smile. The body had been washed. There was no dirt beneath the fingernails. No debris clung to the skin. Whoever left her there had taken time and care. Police arrived within hours. Photographers followed almost immediately. By midday, the crime scene was no longer just evidence. It was an image, captured and circulated. Newspapers rushed to frame the discovery not simply as a homicide, but as a spectacle. The victim was still unidentified, yet the narrative was already forming around her. The medical examiner documented extensive injuries. There were signs of restraint. Bruising and internal damage indicated prolonged violence before death. The bisection of the body showed precision and anatomical knowledge. The cuts were deliberate, not frantic. This was not a killing driven by panic. It required planning, privacy, and control. The victim was 22 years old. Her name was Elizabeth Short. Within days, the press gave her a name she never used in life. They called her the Black Dahlia, borrowing from a recent film noir and infusing the story with implication and darkness. The nickname endured because it served a purpose. It turned a murdered woman into a character, something symbolic, something marketable. From the very beginning, the investigation struggled under the weight of publicity. Access to the crime scene had not been tightly controlled. Evidence handling was uneven. Tips flooded police lines by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Confessions followed, many of them false. Some were encouraged by reporters eager for exclusives. Law enforcement found itself reacting, not leading, while the press constructed a story that moved faster than verified fact. What was known in those early days was limited. The body had been transported after death. The location had been chosen for visibility. The killer wanted the body found quickly. There were no identifying documents, no purse, no shoes. Elizabeth Short was eventually identified through fingerprints sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, matched against military records connected to her father. Even that process took time. What was not known was far greater. Where she had been staying, who she had last been with, how she spent her final days. The gaps were wide, and speculation rushed in to fill them. Los Angeles in 1947 was a city primed for this kind of crime. It was growing rapidly, filled with veterans, transients, aspiring actors, and people living on the margins. Housing was scarce. Policing was fragmented. Corruption was entrenched. The distance between the city's image and its reality was already vast. Hollywood sold dreams. The city buried its dead. The murder of Elizabeth Short quickly became more than a case. It became a mirror. Moralists saw a warning. Sensationalists saw a puzzle. Police felt pressure. The killer saw attention. This chapter is not about theories. It is not about suspects. It is about the moment the crime entered the world. And how quickly control of the story slipped away. Before books, before documentaries, before named villains, there was a body placed carefully in the open, and a city that could not look away. Everything that follows begins here. This is AI True Crime, and today, we're beginning our 6-part series on Los Angeles' most famous unsolved murder, the Black Dahlia. Chapter 2. The discovery of Elizabeth Short's body did not unfold in isolation. Within hours, it was absorbed into a system that thrived on visibility. Los Angeles newspapers moved fast, competing not just to report the crime, but to define it. By the end of the first day, details were already being exaggerated, reframed, and stripped of context. Accuracy mattered less than impact. Police initially attempted to control the flow of information, but they were overwhelmed almost immediately. The Los Angeles Police Department was not structured for a case of this scale. There was no unified command. Jurisdictional boundaries overlapped. Communication between divisions was inconsistent. Meanwhile, reporters cultivated sources inside the department, some eager for attention, others for leverage. By January 16th, the case had a nickname: the Black Dahlia. It appeared in headlines before Elizabeth Short's family had even been formally notified. The name carried connotations that would shape public perception for decades. It suggested mystery, sexuality, and moral transgression. It framed the victim before the facts could. That framing mattered. Once the press settled on a narrative, it influenced everything that followed. Tips began arriving, shaped by headlines rather than evidence. Witnesses came forward with memories that shifted under questioning. Some genuinely believed they had seen something relevant. Others wanted proximity to notoriety. A few wanted to insert themselves into history. The LAPD received dozens of confessions within the first weeks. Most were quickly dismissed. Some were clearly delusional. Others were attempts at misdirection. Sorting through them consumed time and manpower. Each false lead pulled resources away from verifiable work. Evidence collection in the early phase was uneven. The crime scene had been photographed extensively, but contamination was unavoidable. Footprints in the lot were trampled. Curious onlookers wandered close. Items that might have mattered later were not preserved with modern standards in mind. This was not negligence unique to this case. It was how policing worked in the 1940s. The consequences here were severe. The autopsy report became another site of distortion. Medical findings were selectively quoted in the press, stripped of nuance, and often sensationalized. Details of injury were repeated without explanation, fueling lurid speculation. Violence became a spectacle, and the victim's body was treated as proof of something symbolic rather than the result of a specific criminal act. At the same time, police attempted to reconstruct Elizabeth Short's final movements. This proved difficult almost immediately. She had no permanent address in Los Angeles. She moved between hotels, friends' couches, and short-term accommodations. Many people who knew her knew only fragments of her life. Some provided contradictory accounts. Others withheld information, fearing scrutiny. The absence of a clear timeline created a vacuum. In that vacuum, theories multiplied. The killer was imagined as a surgeon, then a doctor, then a butcher, then an artist. Each interpretation said more about the observer than the evidence. What became clear early on was that the killer wanted attention. The body was placed in an open lot, fully visible from the street. It was arranged. It was meant to be discovered. This was not concealment. It was display. The city itself was toned into an audience. That realization changed the stakes. The murder was no longer just about who committed the act, but about how the act functioned in public space. It raised questions police were not equipped to answer. Was this a crime meant to communicate something? Was it meant to provoke fear? Was it meant to mock the system chasing it? As days passed, the investigation grew louder and less focused. Pressure mounted from city officials and the public. Every failure became a headline. Every rumor became a lead. The case began to drift, not because no one cared, but because too many voices were shouting at once. By the end of the first week, Elizabeth Short's murder had already begun to slip out of reach, not because there were no clues, but because the environment surrounding the case had become hostile to clarity. Facts were drowned out by noise. The story had taken on a life of its own, and once that happened, it was never just a murder again. Chapter 3. Once Elizabeth Short was identified, the investigation shifted from shock to reconstruction. This was the phase where police tried to build a life backward. Not the myth that was already forming in the newspapers, but the actual movements of a young woman in the final weeks before her death. That effort immediately ran into structural problems. Elizabeth Short did not leave a neat trail. She had no fixed address in Los Angeles. She paid cash. She stayed briefly in hotels, sometimes registering under her own name, sometimes not. She moved between friends, acquaintances, and short-term arrangements that left little documentation behind. This was not unusual for the city or the era, but it made certainty difficult. The Federal Bureau of Investigation assisted primarily with identification and background tracing. Fingerprint records tied Elizabeth Short to earlier contacts with military authorities through her father. Beyond that, federal involvement was limited. This was a local homicide, and the responsibility remained with the Los Angeles Police Department. Police interviews painted a fragmented picture. Different witnesses described different versions of Elizabeth Short. Some remembered her as quiet and reserved. Others described her as sociable and transient. These contradictions were not necessarily lies. They reflected how people present different versions of themselves depending on circumstance. The press, however, collapsed these fragments into a single narrative, one that emphasized risk, morality, and implication. Meanwhile, physical evidence continued to be reassessed. The condition of the body suggested it had been held somewhere private before being dumped. There was no sign of struggle at the discovery site. No blood pooled in the soil. No evidence that death occurred there. This narrowed the crime geographically while simultaneously expanding it. The killing had happened elsewhere, in a space still unknown. Police canvassed medical professionals, surgical supply houses, and slaughterhouses. They examined hospitals, clinics, and anyone with anatomical training. This line of inquiry was logical, given the precision of the injuries, but it was also broad. Thousands of people fit the general description. Very few could be meaningfully excluded. The press seized on the idea of a medically trained killer. Headlines elevated speculation into certainty. The figure of the brilliant, detached murderer took shape almost immediately. This archetype would follow the case for decades, influencing which suspects seemed plausible and which did not. At the same time, the volume of information became unmanageable. Tips arrived faster than they could be evaluated. Sightings of Elizabeth Short after her death were reported. Some claimed she had been seen alive days later. Others insisted they knew where she had stayed, or who she had argued with, or who she feared. Each claim required attention. Most led nowhere. What made this phase particularly damaging was the absence of a single, stable timeline. Without clarity about her final movements, investigators could not anchor their work. Each new claim shifted the narrative slightly. Each shift created new branches that had to be followed or formally discarded. Behind the scenes, pressure intensified. City officials demanded progress. Editors demanded answers. Police leadership demanded results. The case became a measure of institutional competence, not just criminal investigation. That kind of pressure narrows thinking. It rewards speed over caution and certainty over ambiguity. Elizabeth Short herself receded during this phase. The more investigators struggled to define her final days, the more the public version of her hardened into stereotype. She became less a person and more a symbol, shaped by fear, fascination, and projection. By the time the initial reconstruction phase ended, the case had developed a dangerous imbalance. There was more information than understanding, more noise than signal. The investigation was active, but it was already reactive, chasing fragments instead of building from solid ground. The body had been discovered. The victim had been named. But the center of the case, the place where fact could still assert control, was slipping, and in that instability, something else was beginning to emerge. Not evidence, but performance. Chapter 4. The first communication arrived days after the body was found. It did not come to the police. It came to the press. An envelope addressed in cut-out letters was delivered to the offices of the Los Angeles Examiner. Inside were items that belonged to Elizabeth Short: her birth certificate, photographs, an address book. The package had been carefully cleaned. Even the paper showed signs of deliberate handling. It was signed simply, "The Avenger." This was not a confession. It was a claim of authorship. By bypassing law enforcement and going directly to the media, the sender made a clear choice. The audience was not the police. It was the city. The message was not about resolution. It was about control. More letters followed. Some taunted. Others corrected reporting errors. Each reinforced the same idea. The killer was watching the coverage. The coverage mattered. The murder was not complete without public attention. The press treated these communications as proof of narrative depth, Headlines framed them as evidence of intelligence, even genius. Every phrase was parsed, every detail reproduced. The killer's voice was amplified, repeated, and analyzed in public. Law enforcement had no way to verify the sender's identity with certainty. Some items in the package were genuine. Others could have been obtained through secondary means. That ambiguity became part of the story. Authenticity itself turned into a performance, staged through the media. The language of the letters was theatrical, deliberately archaic in places, self-conscious in tone. It suggested a person aware of how villains were supposed to sound. This mattered less for what it revealed about the sender and more for what it revealed about the era. The cultural script for the intelligent, mocking criminal already existed. The sender stepped into it. The murder itself had already crossed into spectacle through the placement of the body. The letters extended that spectacle in time. They kept the story alive. They redirected attention when interest might have faded. Each communication reignited fear and fascination. There is a temptation to interpret this as artistry, as symbolism, as intention layered with meaning. That temptation must be resisted. What can be said with certainty is simpler and more disturbing. The communications demonstrate an understanding of media dynamics. They show that the sender understood how to manipulate attention. This was not unique to this case, but it was unusually effective. Los Angeles in 1947 was a city obsessed with image. Newspapers thrived on sensation. Radio amplified rumor. The killer's actions exploited these systems without needing to control them directly. The effect on the investigation was corrosive. Each letter forced police to divert resources. Handwriting analysis, paper tracing, ink sourcing, delivery routes. Each possibility expanded the field while narrowing nothing. Meanwhile, the public narrative hardened around the idea of a mastermind, even as the actual trail grew colder. Elizabeth Short disappeared almost entirely in this phase. Her possessions became props. Her name became a headline. Her body became an image replayed endlessly. The focus shifted away from the violence done to her and toward the personality constructed around the crime. This was the moment when the case changed character. It stopped being solely a homicide investigation and became something else, a story told in installments, a performance unfolding in public, a contest between institutions and attention. The letters did not bring answers. They did not clarify motive. They did not narrow suspects. What they did was ensure that the crime would never be allowed to fade quietly, and in doing so, they guaranteed that the Black Dahlia would never belong to the past. Chapter 5. By the final week of January 1947, the Black Dahlia investigation had entered a phase that law enforcement rarely discussed openly, but understood instinctively. The case was no longer governed by evidence. It was governed by urgency. And urgency, once it replaces method, begins to eat its own foundation. The Los Angeles Police Department was overwhelmed by volume. Tips arrived constantly, by telephone, telegram, handwritten letter, and personal appearance. Many were vague, offering little more than intuition or coincidence. Others were elaborate narratives, constructed from newspaper coverage, shaped by what had already been printed, rather than what had been witnessed. Each tip demanded attention, because ignoring even one felt politically dangerous. The result was paralysis, disguised as activity. Detectives were assigned leads that collapsed almost immediately. A reported sighting would unravel under basic questioning. A named suspect would turn out to be hundreds of miles away. A promising story would contradict physical evidence the moment it was examined. The case file expanded rapidly, but it did not deepen. It flattened, becoming a mass of disconnected fragments rather than a coherent structure. Inside the department, confidence began to fracture. Some investigators believed the killer had stable access to a private location within Los Angeles, a space where Elizabeth Short could be restrained, assaulted, and killed without interruption. Others believed the crime bore the marks of a transient offender, someone passing through the city, leaving no roots behind. These competing assumptions mattered because they dictated where police looked, and more importantly, where they did not. At the same time, the department was grappling with the consequences of its earliest decisions. The crime scene had been compromised almost immediately. Too many people had been allowed too close. Too many photographs had been taken before evidence was fully documented. Witnesses had spoken to reporters before detectives ever reached them. meaning that recollections were already shaped by headlines and speculation. These were not minor errors, they were structural failures, and they could not be undone. Publicly, police leadership projected confidence. Press statements spoke of progress, cooperation, and imminent breakthroughs. Privately, investigators understood they were losing control of the narrative, and with it, control of the investigation. Each public declaration narrowed future options. Each claim of certainty made doubt politically unacceptable. The case began to move not in response to discovery, but in response to expectation. This was also the moment when Elizabeth Short herself nearly vanished from the investigation. She remained present as a name and an image, but not as a person. The work of reconstructing her movements, her relationships, and the precariousness of her daily life was overshadowed by the demand for a suspect. The focus shifted away from understanding how she became vulnerable and toward identifying someone who could plausibly be blamed. That shift altered how suspects were evaluated. Evidence became secondary to narrative fit. Investigators asked not whether the facts pointed to a person, but whether a person could be made to fit the facts as they were now popularly understood. Backgrounds were scrutinized not for relevance, but for shock value. Plausibility replaced proof. As the days passed without resolution, exhaustion set in. Detectives worked long hours, chasing leads that led nowhere, revisiting theories already disproven, re-interviewing witnesses whose memories had grown less reliable with each retelling. Momentum became the goal. Activity became the metric of success. By the end of January, the Black Dahlia case was still active, still consuming resources, still dominating headlines. But something essential had been lost. The ability to pause, the ability to admit uncertainty, the discipline required to let evidence lead rather than follow. The murder had not grown clearer with time. It had grown louder, more distorted, more encased in expectation and fear. And once an investigation begins responding to noise instead of fact, the path back to truth becomes almost impossible to find. Chapter 6. Away from the press conferences and headlines, the physical reality of Elizabeth Short's death forced investigators to confront something far more disturbing than spectacle. The evidence did not describe a sudden act of violence, it described duration. The autopsy revealed a pattern of injuries that could not be explained by a single burst of rage. Ligature marks on her wrists and ankles showed repeated restraint. The marks were uneven, indicating bindings that had been tightened, loosened, and reapplied. This was not functional restraint meant only to prevent escape. It was sustained control. Someone had taken the time to bind her, leave her bound, return, and bind her again. Bruising across her body showed clear evidence of blunt force trauma inflicted while she was still alive. These were not injuries caused by a fall or a struggle at the moment of death. Some bruises had begun to swell, indicating they occurred hours before she died. Others showed no swelling at all, meaning they were inflicted after death. The violence was layered. It evolved over time. There were no defensive wounds on her hands or forearms. This absence was as important as any visible injury. It meant Elizabeth Short was not fighting back, not because she chose not to, but because she could not. Her arms were restrained early. Whatever happened to her unfolded while she was helpless to resist. The facial mutilation was precise and intentional. The cuts extending from the corners of her mouth were clean, symmetrical, and deep. They were not the result of wild slashing. They were made carefully, with control, and they transformed her expression into something grotesque and permanent. This was not violence meant only to kill. It was violence meant to alter, to mark, to display. The bisection of the body was even more revealing. The cut was made cleanly between vertebrae, separating the upper and lower halves without crushing bone. This is not something accomplished by chance. It requires anatomical knowledge and confidence. The person who did this knew where to cut and how much force to apply. There was no hesitation in the incision. Equally disturbing was what was missing. There was almost no blood at the discovery site. Given the extent of the injuries, the amount of blood loss would have been extreme. The absence of blood meant the body had been drained elsewhere. It had been cleaned. This required time, water, and privacy. Someone had access to a space where they could wash a body thoroughly, without interruption or suspicion. This detail alone changed the nature of the crime. The murder did not happen in the open. It happened in a controlled environment, a room, a building, a place where noise, movement, and cleanup would not raise alarms. The killer was not improvising. He was operating somewhere he felt safe. Investigators understood what this implied. The killer was not a stranger to enclosed spaces. He was not afraid of proximity. He was not rushing. He was comfortable enough to remain with the body for an extended period of time. That level of comfort suggested familiarity with violence, or at least familiarity with not being interrupted while committing it. The forensic findings stripped away romanticized notions of madness or frenzy. This was not chaos. It was method. The suffering inflicted on Elizabeth Short was not incidental to the crime. It was the crime. These details were known to police early, but they were not emphasized publicly. The press focused on shock value. The reality was quieter and far worse. This was prolonged domination carried out in isolation, somewhere in Los Angeles, while the city went about its business unaware. The question investigators could not answer was the most frightening one. If this could happen to her, behind closed doors, unnoticed, then how many people had passed through that space without ever knowing what had occurred there? And whether the killer had already learned that he could do it again. Chapter 7. By early February 1947, the Black Dahlia investigation had settled into a grim and unfamiliar rhythm. It was still active, still funded, still staffed, yet no longer driven by belief. Detectives continued to chase leads because they were expected to, not because they believed resolution was imminent. The case had crossed an invisible threshold. It had become something to manage rather than solve. One of the most damaging forces at work during this period was the slow degradation of evidence. This was not a single failure, but an accumulation of small procedural weaknesses that compounded over time. Items possibly connected to Elizabeth Short surfaced late, sometimes weeks after her death, sometimes delivered anonymously, sometimes discovered in locations already contaminated by public access. Clothing believed to be hers was recovered in scattered places. But definitive linkage was elusive, documentation was incomplete, handling was inconsistent. By the time some items reached investigators, their evidentiary value had already eroded beyond usefulness. Witness testimony followed a similar trajectory. In the days immediately after the murder, recollections had been fragmentary but relatively unshaped. As weeks passed, those same memories hardened, not through clarity, but through repetition. Witnesses absorbed details from newspapers and radio broadcasts, then unknowingly folded those details into their own accounts. Investigators were left trying to separate original perception from borrowed narrative, a task that grew more difficult with every retelling. False confessions continued to arrive. Some were brief and incoherent. Others were disturbingly detailed, constructed from publicly available information and presented with confidence. Each confession required attention. Each demanded verification. Each pulled resources away from lines of inquiry grounded in physical evidence. None brought investigators closer to the truth. Internally, exhaustion took hold. Detectives worked long hours under constant scrutiny, aware that every decision might be dissected in print the following morning. The pressure was not merely to find the killer, but to appear competent in the face of failure. This atmosphere discouraged uncertainty. It rewarded decisive statements, even when evidence did not support them. The investigation increasingly moved in response to optics rather than discovery. The killer, whoever he was, remained untouched by this chaos. No reliable physical evidence tied any suspect conclusively to the crime. No witness could place a specific individual with Elizabeth Short in her final hours with certainty. The city was full of people who had brushed past her life briefly and forgotten her just as quickly. That anonymity, once ordinary, had become fatal. As time passed, the Black Dahlia ceased to be treated as a solvable crime and began to function as a symbol. It absorbed cultural anxieties about post-war Los Angeles, about violence hidden behind closed doors, about women living on the margins, about institutions unable to protect the vulnerable or contain the spectacle of their failure. The longer the case remained unsolved, the heavier it became with meaning. Elizabeth Short herself was almost entirely lost in this transformation. Her name endured, but her life was obscured. She was remembered as a body, a crime scene photograph, a cautionary tale. The person who existed before January 1947 was buried beneath projection and myth-making. Her complexity flattened into stereotype. This is where episode 1 ends. Not with an arrest, not with a revelation, but with an absence. The absence of answers, the absence of accountability, the absence left behind when violence overwhelms the systems meant to confront it. Next week, in episode 2, we step away from the mutilation and the spectacle. We go back before the nickname, before the headlines, before the mythology. We reconstruct Elizabeth Short's life in verifiable detail, where she came from, how she moved through the world, the precariousness of her existence, and how the press reshaped her story once she was no longer alive to correct it. Before there was the Black Dahlia, there was a young woman trying to survive in Los Angeles. That is where the story continues. This is AI True Crime. The intelligence is artificial, but the crime is real. AI True Crime is written by ChatGPT, read by Speechalo, with music by Mareka.